welcome everyone to the grand finale webinar in the Group of 78 6-session series of webinars on the future of UN peacekeeping in the transition to a more peaceful world, why UN peace operations are critical and need to be expanded. Of course, this welcome is a welcome back to all of you who have been with us for some or all of the previous webinar sessions, and a very warm welcome to new registrants. Since its origin in 1981, the Group of 78 has promoted dialogue about a progressive foreign policy based on the principles of sustainable peace through common security, justice, and inclusion. For this final webinar, the Group of 78 is joined by two co-sponsors, the Rideau Institute on International Affairs and the World Federalist Movement Canada. On 24 September 2020, we had our keynote launch with former head of UN peacekeeping, Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who noted that in spite of growing Security Council fragmentation and even paralysis, something we hope maybe might be behind us now, but who knows, UN peacekeeping mandates are being renewed and more European countries beginning to re-engage in them. On September 26, panel 1 looked at successes and failures and lessons learned, and Professor Lise Howard reviewed the robust statistical evidence that UN peacekeeping works far more often than it fails. Richard Gowan highlighted the challenge posed to UN missions like those in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan by the sidelining of the vital UN conflict resolution role by regional actors with their own agendas. That too harkened back to an admonition by Ambassador Guéhenno about the primacy of politics, that is, of finding political solutions to the fundamentally political problems underlying these conflicts, and the consequent need for UN peace operations to reestablish their preeminent role in facilitating conflict resolution by the parties. On 28 September, panel 2, entitled Controversies, Impartiality, Consent, Use of Force, examined what UN peacekeeping should or should not do, particularly in relation to the use of force, as well as assessing UN peacekeeping partnerships in Africa. Professor Jane Boulden, with us again today, focused on the tension between the core UN peacekeeping principles of consent of the parties, impartiality, and limited use of force on the one hand, and stabilization missions requiring robust use of force on the side of the government of the host nation on the other. Professor Paul Williams highlighted the chaotic array of partnerships the UN is facing in Africa with hybrid UN African Union missions and various other lesser types of support and pressures for financial assistance. Our panel 3 on the future of UN peace operations took place on 3 October. Victoria Holt emphasized the resilience and adaptability of UN peacekeeping, but cautioned that it was not and could not be a counterinsurgency or war-fighting force. She highlighted a recent study on the political practice of peacekeeping on evidence-based strategies to enhance the UN role of facilitating peaceful solutions to conflict. And I note that in the chat function, the link is there for those who are interested. There's a wealth of information on how the UN can better do this and how we can help the UN to better do it. Peter Langille, also with us again today, outlined the potential for a United Nations Emergency Peace Service to replace untimely delays and insufficient resources with a cost-effective means for prompt startup of demanding UN peace operations. He also underscored the preventive and deterrent potential of UNEPs. Panel 4, Contributions by Canada to UN Peace Operations, examined the many steps that Canada needs to take to reestablish its hitherto leading role in UN peace operations. These include much more support for the civilian aspects of peacekeeping, particularly the peace process, significant upgrades in our level of military peacekeepers and equipment, and a commitment to ensuring that Canada's work on economic policies for Inclusive Peace in Fragile States tangibly demonstrates the primacy of political inclusion over support for privileged elites. And we have Walter Dorn from that panel with us here today. All these sessions are available on YouTube and the G78 Group of 78 site. And Sarah Bowles, the Group of 78 Executive Secretary, has, I believe, shared that link with you in chat. Okay, this brings us to today's session. Panel 5, Conclusions and Recommendations. The focus, as the title suggests, will be on key recommendations for actions by governments, especially our own, by parliamentarians, and by civil society. We have asked the panelists not only to speak to specific recommendations for action of their choosing, but also to suggest ways they might be carried forward and by whom. We have 90 minutes in all for our session, with the possibility of a 15-minute extension if needed to respond to all the questions. And so I have asked each of the 3 panelists to speak for 15 minutes. A word about questions that you can pose by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing in your question. If you can multitask, you can do this while the presentations are being delivered, or you can do it in the question time. Once the question's answered, it's supposed to show us such on the list. And I thank the G78 Executive Secretary, Sarah Bowles, in advance for looking after that function for me, because I will never remember, after getting someone to answer it, to mark it as answered. Of course, it's not the end of the world if that doesn't happen anyway. And now to the introductions. Dr. Jane Boulden, speaking to us from Kingston, Ontario, is a fellow of the Queen's University Centre for International and Defence Policy, and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. From 2004 to 2014, she held a Canada Research Chair in International Relations and Security Studies at the Royal Military College of Canada. Prior to that, she was a MacArthur Research Fellow at the Centre for International Studies at Oxford University. In addition to a PhD in International Relations, she also holds a Master's in Law from Queen's University. She has consulted for both the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs, now GAC, and the Department of National Defense, and has been funded by the United States Institute of Peace, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the Ford Foundation. Boulden's expertise centers on the United Nations, particularly UN efforts to deal with conflicts in the post-Cold War environment, as well as on other international and regional organizations and on Canadian foreign policy. Among many articles, Professor Boulden has written for the Journal of International Peacekeeping on the tension between the protection of civilians and stabilization components of modern UN peacekeeping mandates on the one hand, and the core UN peacekeeping principles of consent of the parties, impartiality, and limited use of force on the other. Dr. Walter Dorn, our second speaker, second panelist, one of Canada's most well-known champions of UN peacekeeping, is a professor of defense studies at the Royal Military College of Canada and the Canadian Forces College. He specializes in arms control, peace operations, just war theory, international criminal law, international verification and enforcement, and the United Nations. As an operational professor, he has been a UN electoral officer for the 1999 referendum in East Timor and a visiting professional with the International Criminal Court in 2010. He also served as a consultant with the then Department of Peacekeeping Operations, including on the expert panel on technology and innovation in UN peacekeeping. His latest contribution as a UN technology innovation expert was a 2020 sabbatical exploring technology. It was a 2020 UN sabbatical exploring technologies for testing, piloting, and employing in UN peace operations. The author of many books and articles, in 2016, Dorn was the lead author in a study published by the Rideau Institute entitled Unprepared for Peace, The Decline of Canadian Peacekeeping Training and What to Do About It, a study which was updated for the International Journal in 2018. Turning now to our third speaker. a senior advisor of the Rideau Institute and a member of the planning committee for this series of webinars. Dr. Peter Langille specializes in peace and conflict studies, United Nations peace operations, conflict resolution and mediation, and independent analysis of defense and security policy. He earned his PhD in peace studies under Paul Rogers at Bradford University in the UK, a name which will be very familiar to many of the Canadians listening here today. Peter Langille was one of the key players behind the establishment in 1994-95 of the Pearson International Peacekeeping Training Center, a multidimensional, civilian-run UN Peace Operations Training Center well ahead of its time, but allowed to wither and die for lack of government support in 2013. Peter Langille has also been instrumental in the development of concrete measures to address one of the most stubborn and to date unresolved challenges of UN peacekeeping operations, the timely deployment of the mission. He was a key contributor to Canada's 1995 study towards a rapid reaction capability for the United Nations. In a 2002 book, he developed the initial concept of a permanent UN emergency peace service and further refined it in his 2015 book, Developing a United Nations Emergency Peace Service, Meeting Our Responsibilities to Prevent and Protect. Along the way, and despite the boldness of his vision, he has garnered many supporters, including for the UNEP's concept, including our keynote speaker, former head of UN Peacekeeping, Jean-Marie Guéhenno. And now let us turn to the presentations. After all of that, let us turn to the meat of today's session. And I turn to presentations in the order that I have introduced them. Jane Boulden, over to you.
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Kingston's had its own share of power outages. I'm just saying that in advance. If I disappear, that's why. So yes, thanks, Peggy, for doing all of this, not just this time, but previously. It's always a pleasure to be talking about peacekeeping, and especially in a group, familiar group like this. As Peggy indicated, I'm not going to go on at length about the background of the ideas that any of us are presenting here today, because you can get that both in her summary and by looking at the YouTube video. And I think that a good portion of you were present in the first round for the really interesting sessions. So what I'm going to do is just provide a bit of context and then go over, by sharing a slide, go over the meat of my proposal and talk very briefly about how and whether and in what way that might be carried forward in the current environment. So my focus is on the questions surrounding the tensions that arise across the three founding principles of peace operations, sometimes referred to as the Holy Trinity: impartiality, consent, and use of force. And in particular, recently, in the past couple of years, I've been doing some work on the implications of carrying forward or continuing to uphold those principles in the context of operations that that have protection of civilians and stabilization in their mandates, which is, a pretty inclusive group overall, particularly on the protection of civilians part. That's become a pretty standard piece of any peace operations mandate. And as has been discussed previously in previous sessions, protection of civilians as a result of experience, lessons learned, other kinds of reports, not only is a standard part of mandates, but is prioritized. So where does all that come from? The idea of protection of civilians, the idea of stabilization as a mandate, meaning supporting, openly supporting a given government in a conflict, post-conflict situation, are part and parcel of a general trend in which the Security Council has over time been willing to expand mandates, been willing to itself engage in lessons learned processes, and then build that into mandates in other situations. But it's also part of what peacekeeping is generally, or peace operations. It is a fundamentally adaptive, reactive technique that is, part of its definition. It's not in the charter. It's an ad hoc creation. And there's huge advantage in that, in the sense that there is all that flexibility to add in and adapt and change a focus and add priorities over time and to respond to the situation on the ground. The downside of that is that, I would argue, is that in an area which the Council hasn't adapted fully is in maintaining those foundation pieces: consent, impartiality, minimal use of force, without considering the implications for those foundation pieces with the expanding mandates that it has in front of it, or that it has been authorizing. And then you add in the other layer of adaptability, which is that the Security Council has increasingly authorized the role of regional organizations, either on their own or in conjunction with the UN in various ways, in carrying out their mandates. And this has added that layer of question about how those three ideas, particularly impartiality, but all three ideas, are being maintained in a complex environment with a complex mandate. So that's my starting point. And my key argument is that we need to reconceptualize, and that may not be quite the right word, we mean to perhaps expand our understanding of the three foundation points for peace operations, and be a little more nuanced about how they're applied. I say, ultimately, we're talking about the Council. But in order to get the Council thinking this way, we need to get other actors thinking this way. We need to get other people discussing these kinds of ideas in order to move them forward. So I'm just going to share my screen briefly because the visual, I think, might help for a minute or two. So hopefully, tell me if not, you have in front of you a single slide with a proposed peace operations spectrum. Thanks, Walter. On my left, assuming your left as well, we have the traditional peacekeeping operation where impartiality, consent, and the use of force and self-defense or minimal use of force are pretty much ironclad. This is sort of the traditional Cold War idea where you're really talking about states as the main actors, this is the origins of the idea of what we now refer to as peacekeeping and increasingly more broadly peace operations. At the other end of the spectrum over there on the enforcement side, this is the classic Chapter 7 operations where there's absolutely no need for consent. You are not at all impartial, and it's full-on use of force without any kind of caveats. This is the classic kind of coalition type operation, as in, for example, in the early 90s when there was the UN authorized US-led operation to push Iraq back out of Kuwait. What's happened over time is that, as I spoke about, those increased mandate tasks and various ways of adapting peace operations in conjunction with an increased complexity of the conflicts on the ground and an increased number of actors of different kinds on the ground, is that the three principles are often under stress. And I've used here on the slide for the purpose of illustration the stabilization mandate, because it's makes the point in the clearest way. So when we're in a stabilization operation, as I said, we're in a situation where the mandate is clearly calling for the peace operation to be in support of the government in question. That is, under the current environment, maintained as an impartial an impartial operation with consent of the government where minimal use of force is in existence. But by claiming impartiality or implying impartiality, right, the mandate ignores the tension between the fact that there's an open support for the government in an ongoing conflict situation or in an early post-conflict situation, and brings that question of impartiality into question. So my proposal is that we think of a separate set of operations where it's clear the mandate is not impartial. You still have consent. You have to have consent, at least of the government in question, because you're there to support them. And you would maintain force in self-defense, probably more broadly defined, more openly, either Chapter 7 or Chapter 7 with specific provisions for the kinds of situations in which force is being used. But the key is to let go of the idea that the mandate itself is impartial. And doing this requires one more step, which is to see a separation or a distinction in impartiality where we speak of the mandate and whether it's impartial or not, and the implementation of the mandate and whether it's impartial or not. And what I'm speaking of here is that we let go of the idea that the mandate is impartial. Still means that it will be impartially implemented on the ground. So that's the basic proposal and idea. How would we carry this forward? It's not, there is no easy path. Partly because it does involve nuance, and conflict situations do not deal well with nuance. The United Nations does not always deal well with nuance. However, we're at a moment when peace operations are getting a certain degree of attention. We have the Stimson Center studies. We've had the UN 75, we've had the Agenda for Peacekeeping under the Secretary General. There's a best practices unit at the UN has been engaging in a pretty active consideration of the future of peace operations. So there is a certain degree of momentum might be too strong, but a critical mass of discussion happening these days, in spite of the fact that the Council itself is going through a difficult time, even in the context of a change of administration on the US side. One possibility, and Peggy mentioned this to us when we were talking about what we were going to be doing, is to particularly think of Norway and Ireland. And Norway has on its list of areas of focus as part of its agenda for being on the Council, the protection of civilians. And so, whereas I used stabilization as the example, we could equally talk of protection of civilians as being a kind of situation where we need to consider how impartiality works and the impact on the interaction between the three foundational pieces. There's a psychology part to this as well. The Council has, psychology is maybe not the right word, but the Council keeps these three foundation points for some pretty good reasons, and especially on the impartiality side, it gives it that distance. It allows it to say, we're doing this because the parties agree, and we're in support of what the parties have agreed. And so that distance is going to be hard to give up, but they have de facto given it up by agreeing to support a particular government, I would argue. And so we just need to acknowledge that. Okay, I think I'm at the end of my time, so I'll stop there, but we can discuss more in questions if people would like to do that.
Thank you, Jane, very, very much. Yes, I'm sure I've actually got a question to ask in question time, but I'll wait. I'm going to abuse my role as chair and get that question in, I think, off the top. But that's after we hear from from both the other two speakers. And so Walter Dorn, you're up.
Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Make sure my audio is okay. Okay, delighted to be with you, and thank you, Peggy, and others for organizing this webinar on an incredibly important activity that we're discussing: how to improve UN peacekeeping. And I think the subtext of the entire webinar series is that peacekeeping principles are sound, though they're being challenged and they may need to be modified, as Jane has just alluded to with the impartiality. But the basis of peacekeeping is really important to help bring war-torn nations out of conflict. The practice is vital, though insufficient. And I should emphasize that I've seen this again and again on the tactical, operational, and strategic levels. And just to give you an experience of my own, drawing from the work as an electoral officer in East Timor, one of my translators was Simao, and he told me that 3 times there had been militias that had been sent to Dili, the capital, to assassinate him. And each time he managed to evade them by hiding. And now he was with me in the very town from which the assassins were sent, in Swai, in Zumalai province, Kobalima province of East Timor. And Simao was very bold, and he was with me all the time, and he was wearing the UN blue vest along with myself. And I said to him, "Aren't you worried that they would assassinate you now?" And he said, "No, as long as I'm working with you, I'm safe." That the action of being in the UN saved him from further assassination attempts. And that was an example of the utility of having an international presence in a territory which is under Indonesian occupation, and which otherwise he would have been assassinated. Now, after the UN ran the referendum, then the Timorese voted to become independent as a nation, the Indonesian government had a reign of terror, and Simao had to hide again. And another one of my workers, Domingos, was actually killed in the Swai massacre of 6th of September, 1999. And the UN was impotent to do something about that Indonesian military force. But the nations of the world decided through a Security Council mandate to send an Australian peace enforcement unit, something could be added to Jane's chart, somewhere between stabilization and enforcement, the Interfet mission, which allowed the show of strength needed to prevent Indonesia from actually challenging it. It was backed by strong international pressure on Indonesia, including the threat of withdrawing World Bank loans. But fortunately, it was not another Rwanda. Within 10 days, there were Australian peacekeepers on the ground. And 2 weeks later, the UN was solidly back, and the UN administered the territory for 2 years during a transitional period. And after that, East Timor became an independent nation, and with membership at the United Nations in New York. And this, just a small example, shows how at the tactical level, it influenced lives. At the operational level, we could run a successful referendum to allow people who had been under 450 years of colonization and occupation, that they could actually have a say in their future. And then at strategic level, that we can introduce a new country through a UN peace operation. And there have been many other successes elsewhere, helping end the civil wars in Central America, dealing with West Africa, countries like Liberia, for which was run by a dictator, Charles Taylor, or Sierra Leone, where blood diamonds were fueling the conflicts for so long. There are many cases. I could cite Cambodia, which the UN helped to dislodge the Khmer Rouge by forcing it to divide into whether to run in the elections of 1993. And the former Yugoslavia, where the UN had so much trouble in the period from 91 to 95, but with robust enforcement mechanisms, it's provided by NATO, and then a robust peacekeeping operation also ran by NATO, then transferred to the EU. The process of peacekeeping was shown to be extremely valuable in territories where people thought there could never be peace there. And even the failures like Somalia and Rwanda point to the necessity of having peace operations. When Somalia was abandoned, we let the Somalis be subject to the outrageous forces of piracy, of warlordism, of famine, and the international community ignored it for over a decade to its own peril. And in Rwanda, another lesson can be learned, the fact that the mission was shrunk down to just 300 peacekeepers, and yet they could save 20,000 lives, is a strong testament to the value of having boots on the ground. Even so few could actually be the kind of observers, the kind of protectors in places like the Roma soccer stadium or Kin Faisal Hospital or the Hotel Mille Collines, where there were Tutsis and moderate Tutsis who had taken refuge against the genocidaires, and the UN was an important presence and allowed them to live to see another day and another year. But in all of these examples, there's so many times when the UN could have done better. It's heart-wrenching to see the times where the UN was under-equipped, under-resourced, underfunded. And of course, the critics will point to the times of where the UN hasn't kept a perfect peace, or say that there's no use peacekeeping where there's no peace to keep. Well, of course, you need to have an international presence in an area where there is opportunities, potential windows of opportunities to make a difference. And of course, there will be no perfect peace. You wouldn't need to send people there in the first place. But you need to have the military, police, and civilians who have gained experience over decades to be able to lend a helping hand, help negotiations between conflicting parties, wait for the opportunity when the conflicting parties are going to be tired of their fighting, and also creating the structures for human rights monitoring, for child protection, for security sector reform, for all the wide range of tasks that are currently done in multidimensional missions. And if we look at those tasks, you see that there's a huge capability to performance gap. And the UN is really under-resourced. So now that we're at the end of the webinar series, and we start to think, well, what can we do to improve the UN, to strengthen UN peacekeeping, and what particularly Canada and other Western countries can do, we can start to think of the means by which we can make some sort of contribution. And in order to do so, I'll see if I can also share my screen, and we can see if I can show you some of the opportunities for contributions. Let's just see. I must have here my notes to my screen. So what I do, and can you see the tracking the prompt? Oops, just disappeared. 1 second. I keep a track of Canada's promises in peacekeeping, and I look at how it could be fulfilled in the modern day and where Canada is in fulfilling those promises. It's on the website, walterdorn.net/256. And one of the things I look at is our current statistics and our promises. So let's look at the promises. We promised to the international community that we would provide in the London Ministerial up to 600 uniformed personnel. That was in 2016. We made renewed promises and specific promises about a rapid reaction force and tactical airlift. And the minister's mandate letters, including the most recent one for the Minister of Defense and Foreign Affairs, have information about what the Prime Minister's request to expand support for UN peace operations. Now, if we look at the latest statistics, we find we're far short of the 600 uniformed personnel. We're only at 39. And if you want to look at that in terms of the historical contribution, I can give you another graph. Here, this is looking at historical contributions from 1956, when Lester Pearson proposed the first peacekeeping force. We had 1,000 military deployed. Then with Cyprus, we went to over 2,000. When the UN Emergency Force 2 was created, we were about 2,000. And the disengagement observer force in Syria. Then when the end of the Cold War brought the new missions in Somalia, Cambodia, and Bosnia, We went to 3,300 in 1 month. That's July of 1993. And then we saw a steady decline along with the UN's decline. And we had a few short spikes with UNME, UN mission in Ethiopia, Eritrea, then a short mission in Haiti, and then a number of missions since then. And so that's the overview that for more than 40 years during the Cold War, we had more than 1,000 peacekeepers deployed, military personnel deployed on peacekeeping. So that's a kind of standard that even our 600 military and police promise is very small in comparison with historical review. Now, if we look at the places where we are in, Haiti, Mali, DR Congo, Cyprus, South Sudan, and the Middle East being Lebanon and Syria, as well as Jerusalem, you see that these are all good spots. And the peacekeepers there are doing good work. We just need to do more of it. So let's look at this 39. It's very close to less than half a year ago, we were at the all-time low of 34 personnel. And this is at a time when the government is saying that we should be increasing. The Martin government handed the Harper government over 300 personnel. Then the Harper government reduced it by withdrawing the peacekeepers in Syria, that is in Golan Heights. And then we had an average around 150. If you look at the Trudeau government, you see that even if you include the spike in Mali, which you see over here, the spike from 2018 to 2019, you're still at 50% less than what the Harper government provided during its 10 years. So we really haven't seen this re-engagement in peacekeeping. And I think the women and men in uniform are the best thing that Canada can provide to the UN, which is a capacity for well-trained, bilingual, and the people that I deal with daily in my work, training at the command and staff level and the national security level, where I see these people are well-equipped. And as one colonel told me, Canada has a Ferrari in the garage, but we don't send it out. We don't use it on these missions where we could really deploy excellent capacities and a well-trained personnel. Women in peacekeeping has been a major rhetorical area for the Canadian government, but we have only 8 women in peacekeeping as of the end of last year, that is a month ago. 8 women, and yet we're egging the world on to provide more women in peacekeeping. I think it's verges on the point of hypocrisy that Canada can only provide 8 women, only 5 military and 3 police women to the rest of the world in UN peacekeeping. We can look on to other areas at UN headquarters. We don't deploy any military personnel in the Office of Military Affairs. And we used to head that office under Maurice Burry in the 1990s. And there are 70 countries that are doing that. So I think that's really something we can improve. Leadership. We had 9 commanders of peacekeeping operations in the 1990s. We've had none since. Services. We could provide the tactical airlift, which is one area where the government promise has been achieved. We do provide an active airlift, but it's only for a few days a month. We don't actually have a sustained contribution there. We have yet to provide the quick reaction force. It's the slowest deploying quick reaction force in history. We promised it back in Vancouver in 2017, and 3 years later, we haven't seen the QRF deployed. And we haven't deployed to new peacekeeping missions, new for police forces. Financially, we are consistent. We pay our dues in full, on time, and without conditions. But that's mandatory contribution to all member states. Training, we're supposed to be doing much more, but we are failing in doing training activities as we promised, including through the ELSI initiative, which has released almost nothing for actual training efforts in comparison with the donations that we put in of over $20 million from Canada and other nations in the 2018 ministerial. Intellectual political contributions. You know, there are a few scholars who are making some contributions in some areas, Jane included, and Peter, my fellow panelists. But as a whole, what has Canada done? I have to say, given our protection of civilians work in 1999 and 2000, given our responsibility to protect, given the major thinking about peacekeeping over the decades, we really haven't contributed much in the last decade or two. We can say that the Vancouver Declaration on the recruitment of child soldiers, on peacekeeping and the recruitment of child soldiers, and is a major contribution, the Vancouver Principles, mostly sponsored because of another thinker who had retired from the government and was thinking, and that was Romeo Dallaire, the former commander of the mission in Rwanda. So when the government says that it was on track or actions taken, progress made, it's falling far short of what it could do. The last area that I'll touch on is relating to the technology, and it's an area that I work on, and I just spent almost a year with the UN trying to look at new technological innovations, and Canada could contribute so much. We provided armored reconnaissance vehicles to the mission in Ethiopia and Eritrea, and we could really deploy the updates of those vehicles, the TAPVs, and the abilities to be the eyes and ears of the UN. Particularly during this COVID period, there's a necessity for remote monitoring. The UN can't have the same level of interaction with the local population. So they need to use remote monitoring from the air, from space, from ground sensors to be able to detect what's going on. When are the bad actors, the spoilers of the peace process, planning to attack? So better intelligence can give you a better response capability. You can better know where to concentrate your forces and how to prevent them. And there have been cases where advanced sensors have been used to stop hostilities. And these are key in UN history. We also need more robust. The peacekeepers have too often sat away from the conflict, knowing that it's brewing, but just unable to intervene, or as General Dallaire called it, being deaf and blind in the field, as well as not having the capabilities to intervene. And here the UN needs to have more robust forces, and Canada has provided them. We showed the robustness in the Medak pocket in Croatia when we were part of UNPROFOR. And we have shown it over the years, the robustness. And so in a QRF, we would really want a robust force. And in Mali, we had a robust protection force for our aeromedical unit. But when the battle was going on, we didn't deploy those units. We didn't deploy that unit. We allowed the conflict to go on, and then afterwards come and arrive and provide medical support with the protection unit. But there's so much more that the UN needs as it cries out to be able to solve the problems of conflict in the world today. And Canada is in a good position to contribute, but so are a lot of other Western countries. You know, France has deployed more, Norway has deployed more, Ireland provides over 600 peacekeepers. No wonder we lost our bid for the Security Council when we are coming down with peacekeeping in the 30s in terms of the number deployed. But there are examples of other countries that are leading, and I long to see the day where Canada can once again become a leader, a progressive leader for international peacekeeping, and to support the rules-based international order that we so often speak of and we so much benefit from in our area of the world. And now we have to spread that benefit to other countries, including by augmenting the effectiveness of peacekeeping. So I thank the organizers for bringing us to the point where we can look at these proposals, try and apply pressures on our governments to live up to their own promises, and to find new ways of contributing to more effective peacekeeping. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Walter. And now we turn to our last, but certainly not least speaker, Peter Langille.
Thank you. Many thanks, Peggy, and thanks for everyone who's contributed, participants and the organizing team. Most appreciated. I'm here to explain a United Nations Emergency Peace Service, a relatively big idea, yet one to complement our current approach. In our last round, I described a potential storm of concerns for UN peace operations, including our shared global challenges, new emergencies, inadequate support and funding, the absence of an influential constituency to help, and too few big and bold ideas to actually inspire and motivate people, along with a new sense that the UN system can't really do more than just incremental reform. people are already feeling the retrenchment and do less limited agenda. Definitely in Central African Republic, in Darfur, Myanmar, Libya, Ethiopia, and our lists of suffering are about to go wider, I fear. Yet, since our October round, we've also heard the World Economic Forum call for a great reset, followed by a wider echo to build back better. Even prominent scientists now claiming that we need to look at system shifts. And next door, we see the officials who campaigned on a return to normalcy are surprising with big, bold changes. And we see a lot of big, bold ideas moving up around a just recovery, a Green New Deal, even a great treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. Very promising. Yet, why aren't we seeing more big, bold ideas to improve UN peace operations? None from UN 75 that I could see, or from the Stimson Center. And IPI is very cautious and timid on this. Deep cynicism on the UN's future is almost system-wide. But if we're actually close to a transformative moment, profound change, my fear here is not that we aim too high. The more tragic outcome is that we're too timid and we just suggest too little to matter or even be noticed. Recently, and I think we heard either Jane or Walter mention Rania Dagash, but she's head of peacekeeping best practices. And she opened up a little more space in a brief talk to IPI, suggesting the world's riddled with crises, but transforming really radically. We have to be creative and innovative in developing our peacekeeping toolkit. Think more about nimble, agile operations, less on large ones. And think about being able to respond, anticipate, rather than react. And really rethink peacekeeping thoroughly. That's odd to hear as a comment from peacekeeping best practices, but it's pretty much what she said. And Rania's points suggest what may be a new receptivity to more than the routine tinkering in UN circles. For me, she also overlooks what's equally important in a period of profound change and transformation. And that, I think, it's crucial now to restore a vision of a more effective UN. The vision of the UN Charter is still universally appealing, compelling. People want a UN that can save succeeding generations. And second, the UN and governments need viable policy options that can convey and enable the vision, or they won't even try. And we can hardly call for a shift if we don't have plans to make one happen. Third, security in the future, if there is to be one, isn't likely to depend on our armed forces systems to destroy and damage, but on our capacity to provide prompt help here and globally. So some ask which policy option might motivate and mobilize sufficiently to really improve peace operations, even improve prospects for disarmament, help address our shared global challenges. I've suggested the proposed UN Emergency Peace Service might help. Others think it could be a potential game changer to help with an array of decent objectives. I think it's fair to say that the UNEP's idea is understood by most international participants in this event. At least most experts know of the why, where, what, who questions. But I don't think that many in Ottawa know of this idea. So I'm going to provide a very brief overview again and offer no conclusions, simply one recommendation. But a heads up, my recommendation is for one focused event, hopefully one that leads to others. I'm going to need your patience very briefly as I try to screen share my PowerPoint infomercial. Yeah, I do need a teenager for this, sorry. Is that up and clear? Super. Okay, 4 long-standing challenges drove the development and influenced the design of this UNEPS option. And the following 4 remain problematic, often jeopardize UN peace operations, UN credibility, even UN prospects for attracting support and funding. Now, these are very tough tasks for great powers with large resources and massive standing capacity. They become far tougher tasks when the UN must try to borrow these resources on short notice from around the world, then train, deploy, and assemble them together in a multinational formation. Obviously, that doesn't work to prevent much, as it's a slow, arduous process, which also leaves people without protection, often for a year and a half before an operation can deploy. A standing permanent first responder service, well, that's the way professionals provide timely help in emergencies. We can see that 911 service in almost every town, province, and city here. And I really think similar services should be available elsewhere. I think you'd agree. So a UNEPS is to complement existing arrangements with a first responder, one that's competent, readily available at the outset of emergencies. And to address future emergencies, a UNEPS has to be multidimensional with civilian, police, and military elements. To be cost effective, it has to be multifunctional and capable of providing sophisticated responses to diverse crises. This service will have to be very busy. It'll have to be widely valued, seen as worthwhile, if it's to avoid being axed under budget pressures. And as this will be a new UN service, the UN can ensure it's gender equitable and draws on recruited volunteers from all regions. We do know increasing the role of women in peace operations works, improves on peace building, conflict resolution, mediation, and more. A UNEPS could be a big boost to raising standards system-wide. A UNEPS would have an operational headquarters at a designated base, 2 mobile mission headquarters with similar deployable elements. You're looking at the outline of a proposed operational headquarters with the offices needed to direct, train, move, deploy, and support. Not essential to this, but now these are the deployable elements. So you'll see a relatively robust brigade group on the left side of the screen with reconnaissance, infantry, aviation, logistics, and a mobile hospital. On the right side are the police and civilian services, including teams for human rights, conflict resolution and mediation, peace building, disaster and environmental response, health, and medical. Why the model? Well, it's really just to help people, help the member states, help the UN by providing a modest capacity to fulfill an array of assigned tasks, even more tasks than we currently do. I think this is fair, and I think a UNEPS would help reduce each of these 5. It's not fluff. The case on each is rather strong. But if a UNEPS helped to reduce just one of these 5, it would still be a very cost-effective, smart investment. Another inconvenient truth is that we can't afford to have most of 194 countries constantly preparing for more war. Those resources are just urgently needed if we're to address our climate breakdown, our health emergency, our just recovery in the midst of a depression. So isn't something like this perhaps crucial to restore the vision of a UN that can actually save succeeding generations? Perhaps also as a security guarantor that can build the confidence and trust urgently required for disarmament. There also freeing up resources to save people on the planet. Yeah, just one step in an overdue process, but not a very fun step. Yeah, you know. Clearly, there's a lot to do if you may have spare time, extra money, but these are the objectives for the next 2 years. And this is my one big recommendation, a focused event. It's really key to refine plans, to find help and resources, to attract supportive networks. An event generates the interests and starts the networking. Campaign follows once the networks pull together. We've yet to try that. Perhaps we will. It's doable. It's not mission impossible. It's happened elsewhere, but not in a coherent, sustained campaign. We see the potential to develop a supportive network here. Certainly, the Group of 78's been super at conferences and reports lately. The Rideau Institute has been great of late. The World Federalist Movement, the institutional anchor for 20 years. Pugwash supported the UNEP's idea at a Halifax International Conference in 2003. Project Save the World, UNEP's attracted the most votes overall in their large war and weapons category. UNAC, who we don't hear from very frequently, actually hosted a series of conferences on peacekeeping, with one in Kingston. I think, Jane, you were there too, that focused on rapid deployment, covered UNEPs decently, attracted considerable interest. So a network's not mission impossible. A transnational advocacy network's a little more ambitious. Bit of a stretch for my brain today, but definitely worth further thought tomorrow. I can see how some of these organizations might want to pull together. Potential network of supportive Canadian parliamentarians. Well, everyone knows who. Some members of parliament know how to introduce ideas and progressive policy options. Most should know of how to campaign. We recall our parliament had an all-party genocide prevention committee, and all political stripes should be able to cooperate on a UNEP's network and campaign. A network of supportive member states. Well, that's been done before. Canada once helped to organize the Friends of Rapid Deployment group. We definitely find support from others, especially in the European Union and the African Union, probably even the P5. And the interests of the P5, thankfully, appear to be aligning cooperatively. France might help. It's already moving ideas and initiatives via the Paris Peace Forum. Macron isn't shy with Make the World Great Again. Everyone knows China's taking a lead role in peacekeeping. Both China and Russia have been pretty heavily hit and vilified, but both are also stressing peaceful coexistence, common security, sustainable relations in their speeches. And we shouldn't forget the United States had a House Res 213 calling for a UN emergency peace service. So there is some potential for a network of supportive member states. Canada could definitely take a lead role. When we last did polls on a standing rapid reaction force for the UN, 74% of Canadians strongly supported the idea. Toronto Star has asked Prime Minister Trudeau to lead on UNEPs. Globe's been favorable to the UNEPs idea. The adults in the P5 in Russia, China, US, and France appear to be aware that they must avoid confrontation and that deeper cooperation is now crucial. So our PMO could revise the plans and push an international coalition. On this occasion, I think a Canadian government could actually drive and develop the idea. If we can inspire people in government to aim a little higher with this idea, there's a far better chance of having a UN-equipped, funded, and capable of assigned tasks. That's enough from me. Thank you again, all.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our three speakers. Panelists, very, very much. Lots and lots of ideas, building on what we've heard in the previous sessions, and some ideas on how we can push some of these things forward further. Including, and I like Jane's reference to Norway and Ireland. I mean, they beat Canada out for the seat on the Security Council. So let's hold them to their, their standing, having beaten Canada. Okay, what can you do on UN peacekeeping? And she's made a very specific proposal. I see that we have. We've had 6 questions answered. People can see those questions under answered on the question and answer. So I'm not going to go through those. And I'm just going to go to the new questions. But I said earlier that I was going to come back to a point, because this is something that that we've had discussion. I mean, Jane Boulden's proposal, Dr. Boulden's proposal, of course, she brought this up in her previous session, and we've talked about it and we've looked at it in the preparation of a report. And so I just wanted to come back to one point that I'm not sure was as clear this time, and that is with respect to consent. Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jane, but it seems to me what you're suggesting is a modification to the impartiality principle, not to the consent principle. And the interesting thing is, of course, right now we have, as you pointed out, we have all the parties, the major parties. I mean, there's always an issue about some that might not be in, but the major parties must all agree to the mandate. And we have them with these stabilization mandates, therefore agreeing to the stabilization mandate, which means they're agreeing that in terms of the mandate, at least it's not an impartial mandate. So, I very much like your point about de facto. What we're trying to do is to acknowledge what is de facto already the case. The parties have agreed to a mandate which favors the government in terms of support to the government by the peace operation. But the implementation, they're assured that the implementation of that mandate will be impartial. I don't know if you want to add to that or clarify if I've got the right understanding of that, because I think that's very, very important, that we're not actually changing what the parties consent to. We're clarifying or perhaps making clear what is implicit in what they have consented to. I'll turn to you.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. No, you have it exactly right. And if I might have been rushing at that point to stay in time. So if I wasn't as clear on that, thank you for clarifying. But that's exactly it, right? It's to bring forward what is already in effect happening and be clear about it, to eliminate the complications and the tensions that not being forward about it creates.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn to the questions that we've got here. The first one from Paul Mayet is okay. There's a long statement here, which I think I hope everyone is looking at the question and answer so they can see it. But in a nutshell, what he's talking about, a recent initiative is the development of a UN resolution for the establishment of member state ministries and infrastructures of peace, hoping to be tabled in the UN General Assembly in the fall 2021. The current sponsor is Costa Rica. This is the crux of what I think is Paul's point is, we need to change the larger peace environment. So this is a question regarding the larger environment within which we're talking about better integrating UN peacekeeping capacities with, as Paul put it earlier in the question, with nation state peace capacities. So his question is, we need to change the larger peace environment should Canada be a co-sponsor. So, I mean, this can stand as a comment, a very powerful comment, or if any of the panelists, just put your hand up if any of you want to add something to that. Okay, Walter, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for continuing to promote that. We often know it as the Department for Peace Initiative. This one is at a global level, so we can have departments of peace established in governments around the world. I think it's an excellent idea. I don't see a lot of government willingness, and when I'm just trying to get double the number of peacekeepers or triple, so we're somewhere over 100, where we were in the Harper government time, I already find that there's so much resistance to doing the small measures that sometimes when I think of the big ones, I shy away from them. But just like your proposal for peace ministries in governments, it would be good for Canada to co-sponsor that. It's something we should push for. And if governments show examples, including our own, we could increase the peace component within the Department of National Defense. Right now it's DPK Paul that does the peacekeeping, and in GAC it's peace ops. But if we could see a stronger entity, it would give them more institutional clout so it can begin to create the full implementation or even partial implementation of the promises that were made. So a Ministries for Peace is a good idea, and doing it in a global push is a good idea. And I think that's good to raise it at this point. The same thing with UNEPs. We should be pushing to get UNEPs done. We should create the global coalition that Peter is suggesting, and I think there's excellent work. And at the same time, we want to create the little initiatives too. We want to support a standing police capacity that already exists in Brindisi. We want to be able to create a standing military capacity. Increasing the Office of Military Affairs, having a few people who are permanently employed, soldiers permanently employed by the UN at UN headquarters that can form a nucleus for future operations. There's a spectrum of activities that can be done in all these areas. And I think we should pursue the small ones and the big ones alike, because sometimes the big ones may be the ones that catch the eye of a political leader who wants to make a big difference. And by promoting these ideas, we're helping keep them alive for the time when someone can actually implement them.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you very much for that. I'll turn now, I think, okay, the next question is from Douglas Roach. We see it twice, so we're getting the message here. What is the basic reason Canada's involvement in peacekeeping has fallen so low? How can that reason be addressed? So I guess we're back to you, Walter, initially. I think you talked about that a bit in your presentation, but.
Yeah, but I have to say, I've been puzzling over this since Trudeau came in office and said Canada is back. And if I had to summarize it in one sentence, my current conclusion is that the political will is not being applied to overcome the military and bureaucratic resistance. So there's a lot of mid-level officials in the government who would like to see Canada do more. It includes the military advisor in New York. It includes peace ops officials, and things get sent to cabinet and they don't move. There's also the internal resistance within DND, within CAF, the Canadian Armed Forces, and within the Global Affairs Canada exists on different levels as well. And unless there's a political leadership shown, then those initiatives don't go forward. And so it really comes down to the cabinet making this a priority. And cabinet has not done so. Even when the UN waited for 2 months for Canada to provide a force commander for the UN mission in Mali, which would have been very prestigious to have a Canadian force commander, we lost out to Belgium. And that's because the cabinet could not authorize quick enough. And then in order to understand why the cabinet and the political will isn't there, you have to actually look at personalities. We have to look at Stéphane Dion, we have to look at Freeland, we have to look at Sajjan. And I don't think we have time to look into the personalities that are involved and why do we have the paralysis through analysis that it currently exists in the Canadian government. But the overall answer answer would be not enough political will to overcome bureaucratic resistance.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Walter. I'm going to jump in on this. We've looked at this very, very hard. And you mentioned, the lack of, I agree, the lack of political leadership. And of course, it's Global Affairs Canada that has the leadership on peacekeeping, just like there's a civilian head of UN peacekeeping, because overall it's a political enterprise with military support. That's reflected by the fact that GAC has the leadership role. And as you rightly pointed out, I don't think Stéphane Dion was around long enough to be accused of not exercising leadership there, but certainly Minister Freeland exercised none whatsoever. And we can say, okay, she was so preoccupied with Canada-US trade. But now we've got a new minister. We've got a new minister, Marc Garneau. Okay, COVID is on everybody's agenda, but I think we should not assume that he won't be willing. We should really, make the case all over again. I've said before, my own experience with the Defense Minister Sejan was that including in terms of direct personal meetings, he was very supportive, but he was not the lead and was not at the cabinet table, was not getting, of course, he couldn't tell me what was happening at the cabinet table, but reading between the lines, I think he would have welcomed a stronger push from Global Affairs. So all of which to say, we have an opportunity there now with a new foreign minister to really, really make these arguments. So I'm going to go, and anytime any of the other panelists want to jump in on something, just put your hand up because I'm keeping a close watch. Okay. Now, the next question is from Shane. Now, this may be something, some may have names off the top of their head, but it may be something to do in follow-up or in our report. But Shane Roberts' question is, do the panelists have names that could be put into a list of parliamentarians who might be open and supportive? So does anyone want to take that on, or is this a work in progress? Okay, I don't see any, I don't think we're in a position to provide those names yet, but you've made your point. That's something. If we're going to follow up, if we're going to have parliamentarians take an action, then we have to identify those that have been supportive in the past, those that might be supportive in the future. That's fundamental to any effort going forward. Okay, well, I seem to have come to the end of my list of, oh no, here comes a new question, popped up from Robin Collins. Peter, what do you see as key obstacles to a United Nations Emergency Peace Service, UNEPS, given there is such support outside of government? Presumably it being new is a bother, but it's new in quotation marks, like old new, but it's cheaper as an idea long-term. Well, much cheaper, that's for sure. Talking about, and also what might price a UNEPS in miniature. I don't quite get the grammar here, without being incremental and without sufficient structure. So I don't know if you can understand that question, the last part of the question.
What might provide? What might provide?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. And also, what might provide a UNEPS in miniature? Yes, without being incremental and without sufficient structure, or with sufficient structure. Just before turning it over to Peter, I just wanted to note that, of course, the question of cost now, we've got a new American administration, and just in the first steps that President Biden has taken, he has surprised a lot of doubters who thought that he was not going to be, and Peter alluded to some of the, the new green plan. But there were a lot of people that thought he was going to be much more cautious. And on the arms control side, the people that he's bringing into place are people that are, that are doers and are pushing for change. But he's also in a terrible position with respect to, finances and finding the money to do all the things that he wants to do. And of course, the UN is, the US is, I don't know how far, I don't know if you know, Walter, just how far behind they are in their overall dues arrears of their overall assessed contributions and their UN peacekeeping contributions. So the good news is we expect him to pay up, the United States to pay up, and that's more money for UN peacekeeping right off the top. But it also means potentially that they could be very interested in finding ways to stabilize situations at a lesser cost, which of course is the argument with respect to UNEPs. You want to do more with less, you want to do more and it won't cost you more. Here's a great idea. And I mean, there are startup costs, of course, but overall, in terms of the overall cost. But anyway, I've gone on at length. Peter, do you want to address the fundamental point from Robin is pushing you even further, saying, what do you think the key obstacle is, to not getting this idea being taken up, given the kind of support that, I referenced the support from a former UN Secretary General who's a big, who's on every high-level panel out there on UN peacekeeping, Jean-Marie Guéhenno. I mean, he supports it. So anything further you want to add on what the key obstacle or obstacles might be? Other than lack of vision, which is anyway, Peter, you gotta unmute. You gotta unmute yourself there. Okay, you're on.
There's no question vision's declined. Faith in the UN's declined. People don't expect the UN to be able to prevent armed conflict and protect people. That's unfortunate, but I think it's a wider sentiment. I'm not sure that there's all that broad support in civil society or even the peace and disarmament NGO community. We haven't seen one focused event in Canada. So that's a rather tough position with which to leverage the federal government. They're rather aware of what's likely to have traction and be in a position to punish at the polls. But so far, this one hasn't gone above and attracted, I'd say we are not above the radar. We have seen powerful expressions of support from even starting in Cuenca, with the representatives of very diverse sectors of society all came together, and there was unanimous agreement that concept's good, case is solid, models appealing, and should be far better prospects. That we've seen that repeated at almost every place that there's been an event, but no campaign. And there has been a rather deliberate effort to appropriate the idea, claim it, move it elsewhere, and disrupt it. And that's run by a private-public partnership, which has a very tight relationship to the government. That's hurt enormously. So enough, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, I think it's very useful then to be reminded that, yes, in fact, we haven't, it's an idea that has had strong support, but if it's going to have any traction, there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work that has to be done. And Peter's made a very specific proposal about a focused event on that. The next question I'm going to go to is Fergus Watt. And he, from World Federalist Movement Canada, he has said, Secretary General Guterres has called for a new global deal and reset for the organization. What governments are most likely to champion UNEPs? You addressed that a bit. I think you really did address that, Peter, in your presentation, which governments, but anything more you want to add? What are the policy levers in a UN context? Prevention, building on the standing police, regional cooperation. If Peter, you have more comments, or Walter? I mean, the question really has the answer in it. Things to think about are in the UN context, and clearly prevention has a lot of, traction. So, okay, I'm going to move on now to one that is getting into the nitty gritty from Peter Dawson, who is a colleague that I met back when I was an external faculty member of the Pearson Peacekeeping Center. And over many years, we worked together on exercises, on training, helping training military in peacekeeping. I just realized he's helpfully put follow on in his second question. Otherwise, I would have started with his second instead of his first. So here's his first question directed to Peter Langille. With a proposed standing peacekeeping force, UNEPs, how do you see the force generation process over multiple rotations? And what numbers of standing forces might be required to provide the flexibility and response that differentiates different missions? And how might, these are the nitty gritty, and how might attraction, recruiting, and retention work on a global scale? Well, we could have an entire webinar on that, but any comment, there's a sort of a fundamental nugget there about the numbers that might be required given rotation of forces. And so, although as I understand it, UNEPs has always been expressed to be first in and not there forever. But anyway, Peter, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, it's a first responder service. And within the composition are two identical deployable elements, really military brigade group, as well as a full suite of civilian and police services. But this is a 6-month at max deployment. And then the rotations have to be lined up by the UN. So there is a need to ensure augmentation, replacement, rotation. It's not a be all end all, it's to complement the existing by giving it a capacity to get there very quickly, primarily for prevention and protection, but also to lay the groundwork, a good start to anything in the peace building and quick impact project part. There has been work done on some of the questions you've raised. Thank you.
Peter, this is also a concern of mine that if you send a UNEPS and you've quickly use up the 13,000 that are in UNEPs, how can you be sure that member states will come in the back and after 1 or 2 or 3 months start to fill the mission, and then we can have an operation that's in the traditional UN mode? And given the unwillingness of member states to respond, that becomes a problem. However, UNEP still does play an important role, that it allows for a quicker response at the beginning. And then there will be a lot of pressure to be able to get them replaced because they may be needed elsewhere, although some of them might stay on. And then you can ask for the capabilities that the UN has, for instance, through the peacekeeping capability readiness system. And the UN is playing around with the Vanguard Brigade. We could get an integrated system whereby you can pull from different parts. In the case of Canada, we haven't even registered, even though we proposed a quick reaction force, we haven't even registered that with the BCRS. So the first thing would be to get governments to register it. And I also see that in between a standing peacekeeping force that is training all the time, that there's full-time military personnel who are devoted to UN service, who do that full-time as a job. You can also have regional organizations start to try and develop that capacity. And you also have the standby capabilities. So an African standby force. You could get standby forces from Latin America, which are currently contributing a lot to peacekeeping. You could look at the possibilities of rapidly deployable military headquarters, an idea that Canada championed in response to the Rwandan genocide, was needed for an RDMHQ, rapidly deployable military headquarters. So this standby is a stepping stone to a standing force. And there's lots of room to try and improve the standby forces.
Really?
Yep, really.
Okay,
yeah,
well, how come after 25 years, the UN gave up on them because their record is just abysmal. The standby arrangement system never worked. It had to be shelved. There was never a serious deployment from this UNSIS.
I hear your frustration, Peter, and I also
You're
would
going to
like
be
to
able
see
to tell
the
me
UN,
if there's a standby arrangement system that we should emulate that has some potential. Cherbourg didn't work, you know that. It worked for one deployment.
yeah, in Ethiopia, Eritrea, it was useful. It also provides some headquarters elements in West Africa. But in addition, we have to make the current system work better. If we just say scrap it, then we have nothing.
The UN has scrapped the UNSIS, Walter. It put in the fourth generation office run by Adam Smith to replace it because it was deemed to be.
The fourth generation service runs the PCRS system, and I've spoken to Adam about it. So we have to make those systems work better, as well as promote the longer term things. But there's a spectrum of activities.
I think after 30 years, if they haven't worked, you probably should look at what might work. Because, 60 some years ago, we were able to put a man on the moon. So it's not rocket science here that's the problem. It's really political will. And if we keep coming up with alternatives that won't work, then we'll certainly be back in the same mess the next time there's another genocide or a catastrophe. And that's partially why Doug's question resonates here. We'd like to do anything but accept the need for a substantive change in this community. Isn't that correct?
No.
Peter, thank you very much. I think that it's quite respectable to argue for strengthening existing capacity while trying to generate support for a new, even a radically new capacity. I think we have to do both, because no one is going to suggest in their wildest dreams that UNEPS is going to become a reality very quickly. So in the meantime, we have peace operations out there requiring assistance. And so I don't think it's an either or. And I think that we ought to learn very much from, if we can't build on what's gone before and can't learn from what's gone before, then I'm not sure, how we're going to make progress. Roy Culpepper has asked for a question of UNEPS on cost. I think actually in the first presentation, Peter, that you gave the specifics on the cost. I don't know if you want to, add more, but I thought that you had specifically stated what the costing was for a UNEPS. So if you want to repeat that now, or we just refer back to the first, if you've got those numbers.
Projected costs, and they're always guesstimates, but I think you could say startup cost would be approximately 3.5 billion. Annual recurring costs would probably be 1.5 billion. A deployment might cost $1 billion simply to send it, but you're talking about sending simply 6,000 people for a maximum of 6 months. So it's not an overwhelming expense, although airlift is another substantive expense, and moving tactical aircraft into the field for UNEPS, especially a helicopter fleet, that's a pretty big expense too. So the money, I don't think the cost is really the huge impediment here. There's just not a national champion, there's not a global champion. And in the absence of those, we're not going to make headway. We're going to keep playing with standby arrangements for a long time and continue to fail. Now the costs and consequences of failure are going to go up. So I guess it's one of those that keeps coming around. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I feel duty bound. We've gone a little bit over our time. We're out of our questions here. There is a question asking if people know a certain individual, and so obviously, if anybody does, then please type in the answer. Any of the panelists that if they do know the answer, if they do know the individual that's been named. I think we're getting close to the end of our time here. I want to give the panelists a chance to make a wrap-up statement. I do feel that it's important to point out that one of the one of the things that came out throughout our past webinars was the lack of appetite in the good news was the UN Security Council was agreeing on mandates in UN peacekeeping when they were disagreeing on virtually everything else. But the bad news was that no one saw the scope for the Security Council to be daring, to take new steps, big new steps in UN peacekeeping. Maybe that's changed a bit with respect to Biden, and that's, we've got to hope. But the other factor that came up in our series was noting that the UN Security Council Permanent 5, like UN peacekeeping, when the missions don't get in the way of their perceived national interests and overarching objectives. And that quite clearly, if the UN has greater capacity, then some of this, to respond quickly, some of the P5 might get worried. So there's a political dimension. It's not a reason not to do everything we can to push the idea, but there's a political dimension, not just technical dimensions or failure to move things forward. So having said that, I'm going to turn and just ask for a closing comment, as wide or as narrow, but as you might wish. But really, where do we go from here, perhaps, if you want to make a comment on that, or any other aspect of this series? I'll turn to Jane first.
Okay, thank you, Peggy. Thanks everyone for, I really enjoyed the chat, I guess is what it's called, the question and answer discussion there. And I want to come back to one of the issues that arose there, but I'm going to just start by picking up on something that Peggy just said. And so interestingly, I would argue anyway, the Council is most innovative on peace operations at times when it's been most conflictual in other areas. And I'll just use as one quick example, 1956 Suez and afterwards. Now, of course, Suez wasn't a Council move. It was a General Assembly move, but the Council, deeply divided in the 50s, picks up on peacekeeping after that and runs with it, but all the while stuck on other issues. And we can there's more of a pattern over time to that we could pull out. But the broader point, going to Peggy's, that it's the Council is not it's not easy to predict Council behavior. And so it can be that it's innovative when you least expect it, but I would then add it's innovative when it's reacting to a specific unexpected situation, and there's no way to plan for that. On the question, the other point I wanted to pick up on was that there was a bit of a theme in the chat question and answer discussion about getting the government, and I apologize, I can't remember who first raised this, getting the Canadian government activated on a particular item, a la rapid reaction or a la R2P or human security or something else, because it's not, as Walter has so clearly demonstrated, it's doing not much else. And under Friedland, we could argue that idea was perhaps women in peacekeeping, but that's slid. And as Walter showed us, we're not actually doing much on it. So I agree. I think that is a way forward, that you have to find a particular focus, an idea that the government can run with. And to do that, you need to figure out what this government would go for. And we, as Peggy said, have a new minister, at least that as a bit of an opportunity, perhaps. And what would be, it's late in the day, I was about to say receivable. What am I trying to say? What would be receptive, received well at the Council and UN end? And perhaps using Norway and Ireland as the catalyst or the linchpin on that. I don't have the answer to that, but I think that's a good way to think about it. You need to think about the Canadian government, you need to think about the UN end, and what would attract the Canadian government and have a niche entry point. So I haven't provided any other answers other than to say I think that's a good mechanism.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jane. Okay, I'm going to turn next to Peter for closing comments.
I think it's not hard to argue that we might aim higher. I think we have a P5 that might be very receptive, and that there's a sense that they have to get along now, which is well, it's remarkably different and more promising than it was 2 months back, if we step away from confrontation. I do think even the Americans could be encouraged to make substantive changes around peace operations, even around UNEPs. They had a bill in the House of Representatives for it. I don't hold out a lot of hope for Norway, but I'm not sure about Ireland. And there are some very promising signs coming out of the EU and the AU. I would say interest is up on peace operations. If the Europeans are contributing more, the Africans have been carrying the ball for the last, 20 years, really. So stay optimistic. Perhaps for me, I'm sorry, but I'm done with compromising over standby arrangements. I think I worked probably as long as anyone on Cherbourg and followed RDMHQ. To be honest with you, the RDMHQ was canceled solely by one individual, and that was Lloyd Axworthy. And the Americans even funded it, but Lloyd said, and that bedazzled almost all the senior advisors, that Canada, which had championed it, was not going to pay for it, or help even pay for it, after the Americans had thrown big money toward it. So yes, I'd like to see a focused meeting, perhaps 4 focused meetings around all these different issues, because they don't work all that well together. I'm not sure that they are entirely compatible. They're distinct. Fair enough? Okay, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. And I'll turn now, last but not least, to Walter for your closing comments.
Yeah, I think we have to thank ourselves, that is in the peace movement, for keeping ideas alive. They're very important. Peter has been keeping the UNEP's idea alive for so many years now, decades. And it's such a valuable idea. We have to treasure it, and we have to look at ways we can move towards it. And we have to keep it alive so that when the receptivity is there, then a political figure, a nation, a movement can start and make it reality. If I look at the history of international organization, it's often through crises that these ideas, these bigger ideas, get implemented. Lester Pearson had seen the experience of the League of Nations lacking a military force. He wanted the UN to have a military force and was supporting and even double-hatted, or originally single-hatted units, Canadian units, to UN service in the late 1940s, and then they became double-hatted to NATO. And when 56 came around, then the idea that had been circulated, the dream that had been there for having something under UN control, was implemented, because Pearson was of the right mentality and had been thinking about what he called UN peace and police forces, and that he could propose that in 56. And we saw the dawn of the notion of peacekeeping forces, with the first UN peacekeeping force being UNEF. And so keeping these ideas alive is important for the opportunities that may arise when they do in international community. And usually it's through crises that there is a response, there is a reaction, there is some innovation. It took World War I to create the League of Nations, World War II to create the United Nations. Hopefully we'll be spared a World War III to create some sort of world union, but we'll need to have evolution to avoid World War III. and that maybe come through some mini crises. Now, the US has gone through the crisis of a Trump administration, and it is looking for ways to respond and undo a lot of the damage that's being done, a lot of executive action already in the last few weeks. But bigger issues like UN reform can very well be on the horizon. Instead of the patriot emphasis that the Trump administration gave, now it's looking for international cooperation. And I see the Biden administration is helping already. It will contribute. It hasn't paid up its UN arrears yet it hasn't paid its dues even for the year 2021, which are due in January. But the payment of the US already for previous arrears helped me get a paycheck a couple of weeks ago from the UN when it was 8 months in arrears and paying me my consulting fees. And I can see that payment will help peacekeeping because they had a hiring freeze for many months. It can also be that new ideas will come out through the Security Council, and I hope that that we'll see some innovations in Security Council practice. And then thirdly, if all our internal pressure within Canada to help Canada live up to its promises doesn't work, then maybe some pressure from the United States to help Canada do more on peacekeeping will make a difference, so the Trudeau government can move a few millimeters towards the re-engagement, the long-promised re-engagement and support for UN peacekeeping. So I see the possibilities of the US being an influence, including on Canada.
Walter, thank you very, very much. And I thank our speakers, and I thank everyone who stayed as we've gone we've gone over time, a bit over time. Yet once again, I say I would like to thank our panelists and our participants for wonderful presentations and then very, very lively discussion. The webinar organizing committee is the Group of 78 webinar organizing committee is busy working on our conclusions and recommendations document, distilling what we have heard from the webinar series thus far, and to which we will add the insights gained from this final webinar. And you know we're going to have further lively discussion in that working group because you've seen the full range of suggestions from the incremental to much more far-ranging ideas. These conclusions and recommendations will form the main body of our report, which we will distribute widely and use as the basis of our policy advocacy with Global Affairs Canada and with the Department of National Defence and parliamentarians as well in support and civil society in support of UN peace operations. So with that, I thank you all very much. I thank the Group of 78 Executive Secretary Sarah Bowles for her excellent support throughout. I've been sending her panic messages because that power outage at the start completely scrambled all of the controls governing Zoom. And so every few minutes, some bizarre thing happened, and she managed to be able to send me the answer to get things back on track. So a special thanks to Sarah. And once again, thank you all very much. Keep watch for our report and good day. Thank you.